It was the event that brought United States into World War II, one of the largest surprise attacks on the American military in the 20th century. In today's video of the Info Perspective, we will take a look at the Japanese assault on Pearl Harbor. The build-up to World War II in Europe was due to the rising nationalism of Germany and Italy. In Asia, Japan was also experiencing a rise in nationalism, that Japan was destined for greatness. Specifically, the rise in nationalism translated to the endless desire in expanding its territory and becoming the dominant power in Eastern Asia. The rise in nationalism in Japan was due to a number of military, social, and economic factors. One of the first few events which contributed to the rise in nationalism in Japan was the victory in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. Japan started the war in 1904 by attacking and trying to take over Manchuria's Port Arthur, situated west of the Korean peninsula, which was at that time under Russia's control. The war dragged on and was highly unpopular among the Russian people. Hence, Russia had to make a peace settlement with Japan which was highly favorable to Japan, especially the acknowledgement that Port Arthur now belongs to Japan. The defeat of Russia, which was considered a dominant military power in the world, convinced Japan that it would be more than capable of occupying and defeating the East Asian colonies controlled by the other Western nations. The need for more territory was also fueled by its population boom, which rendered Japan to become less and less self-sustainable. Japan was neutral during World War I, hence the country was practically untouched. This allowed Japan's trade and industry to prosper. Moreover, during the 1920s, Japan had implemented policies to encourage families to have more babies. This was due to the need for more manpower for Japan's economic growth. With the population exploding by the 1930s and the industries expanding quickly, Japan realized that it could no longer sustain itself as it is a small nation with very limited land usable for agriculture and factory expansion. Moreover, Japan does not have any natural resources or raw materials and relies heavily on imports. With territorial expansion in other parts of East Asia, Japan residents could migrate to relieve overcrowding and the land could serve as sources of raw materials, food, and markets to sell Japanese-produced goods. One of the first major territorial expansion embarked by Japan was the annexation of Manchuria in 1931, which was at that time under Chinese control. Japanese agents created an episode known as the Woog incident, whereby the Japanese deliberately caused an explosion at a railroad line which was operated by a Japanese company. The Japanese then used this incident as a pretext to launch a full-scale invasion and annex Manchuria within 6 months. Japan then renamed it as Manchukuo and used it as a rich source of raw materials for export to Japan. Japan continued its invasion inwards into China and by 1937, it controlled a large part of Inner Mongolia. In 1940, Japan announced the formation of an entity known as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The sphere was to unify a group of nations and free them from Western authorities. Japan identified that most of the nations to be in this sphere are the East Asian and Southeast Asian nations, as well as several Pacific islands. Japan did emphasize that it was willing to bring the nations in via peaceful negotiations, but would also resort to force if necessary. The sphere was advertised to be beneficial for all member countries, as they will have their own economic, political, and social structures. However, the sphere is just another form of oppressive imperialism which replaced the imperialism previously imposed by Western nations. The Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Navy, Isoroku Yamamoto, oversaw the preparations of an attack on Pearl Harbor. On 26 November 1941, a Japanese convoy consisting of 6 aircraft carriers with a total of 408 aircraft, accompanied by fuel tankers and supporting ships, headed towards Hawaii from northern Japan. United States at that time was also preparing for a possible war in the Pacific. Hence, US bases were strengthened across Pacific Islands, Hawaii, and in the Philippines. As part of the preparation, then US President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered to move the US Navy Pacific Fleet from its base in San Diego, California to Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt thought that the strong Navy presence in Pearl Harbor, closer to its Pacific territories, would discourage any Japanese attacks. Some have said that the decision to move the Pacific Fleet to Pearl Harbor was one of the greatest mistakes the US made prior to the Pearl Harbor attacks. Many American strategists at the time widely believed that the main target of Japanese military attack would be the US-controlled Philippines and not Hawaii. This was because US forces in the Philippines could pose a threat to Japan's ability to transport supplies via sea. Moreover, American authorities believed that Japan would not be able to mount major attacks on Hawaii, where Pearl Harbor is situated, as it is too far away from their bases in East Asia. There was a Japanese embassy in Hawaii, and Japan took advantage of that by sending spies in to collect intelligence on Pearl Harbor. The spy was a young Imperial Navy officer by the name of Takeo Yoshikawa, who was able to provide information on the layout of Pearl Harbor and the ships that would be in the harbor. Moreover, he saw that Sunday would be the best day to attack, as many Navy officers would be on shore leave and away from the harbor, leaving it defenseless. The morning of 7 December 1941, the day of the attack, was a Sunday. Indeed, most of Pearl Harbor's Navy personnel were away from their stations, on shore leave, at church, or off duty. At 3:42 a.m., the periscope of a Japanese submarine was spotted near the entrance of Pearl Harbor. The US destroyer USS Woog responded and sank the submarine at 6:37 a.m. Shortly afterward, two young Army radio operators detected on their radar aircraft approaching towards the harbor. When the Army operators report this to their supervisor assumed that the planes were American B-17 bombers that were in the vicinity. The supervisor later told the two Army operators, "Don't worry about it." The two Army operators continued to monitor the incoming planes. As the fleet grew closer, it appeared much larger than the expected American convoy. They then assumed that their equipment was faulty. At that time, radar technology was very new and many were unfamiliar with it. The Army operators and their supervisors were young and had little training on it, and hence you could roughly understand why their judgment and decision making were very poor. At 7:48 a.m., the first wave of Japanese planes arrived at Pearl Harbor and started bombing furiously. At 7:50 a.m., the Navy signal tower at Pearl Harbor sent a frantic signal to the rest of the base, which was enemy air raid, not drill. The second wave of Japanese planes came at 8:40 a.m. The Japanese were actually planning to execute a third wave of attacks, but decided against it as they feared that the Americans would be ready to retaliate by the time the third wave arrives at Pearl Harbor. Besides the fact that there were minimal Navy personnel on duty, Pearl Harbor was not on high alert, hence it had little to no defense against the attack. There were no anti-submarine nets at the mouth of the harbor. The American planes were out in the open and were wingtip to wingtip, which made them easier to be attacked and destroyed. Moreover, the anti-aircraft guns were unmanned and the ammunition storage units were locked. This allowed Japan to dominate the sky of Pearl Harbor that day. The attack lasted for about 2 hours, and by 10 a.m., the sky over Pearl Harbor was clear. The casualties were immense. On the American side, 2,335 military personnel were killed and 1,143 were wounded. Among American civilians, 68 were killed and 33 were wounded. The material losses were significant as well. 21 military ships were destroyed in total. 3 light cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 3 smaller vessels were among the destroyed ships. At the same time, 188 aircraft were destroyed and another 159 were damaged. Compared to the American losses, Japanese losses were minimal. Only 29 Japanese planes, less than 10% of their attacking force, were destroyed. 5 midget submarines which penetrated the harbor were also destroyed. A total of 64 Japanese military personnel were killed. On the bright side, a large portion of Pearl Harbor's facilities, such as their shipyards, fuel tanks, and power stations, were not damaged. This allowed them to repair their damaged ships within a few months. Moreover, none of their 3 aircraft carriers, which were the most valuable ships of all, were damaged as they were not at Pearl Harbor at that moment. The secret assault on Pearl Harbor delivered a stunning blow to America. War was no longer seen as a possibility, but as a reality, as the attack was an outright act of war. In the early afternoon of 7 December 1941, Secretary of War Henry Simpson called US President Roosevelt to deliver the news on the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt, shocked and solemn, immediately began drafting a speech to deliver to Congress. The next day, on 8 December 1941, the then US President delivered his speech before the US Congress. Millions of Americans listened to his speech, which was the largest radio audience at that time in US history. The President spoke movingly of the tragedy and that Americans can meet the tough challenges ahead. He said that always will be remembered the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people, in their righteous might, will win through to absolute victory. I believe that I interpret the will of Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God. Roosevelt then asked Congress for permission to declare war on Japan. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Both the Senate and the House of Representatives voted almost unanimously in favor of the President's request. America thus declared war on Japan. On 11 December 1941, Germany and Italy, in support of their Axis partner Japan, declared war on the United States. United States then declared war on Germany and Italy. Before Pearl Harbor, 80% of Americans were leaning towards isolationism, which was not to interfere in foreign conflicts. However, an outpour of public approval for the war came after the Pearl Harbor attack. The public approval was fueled by grim reports of the Pearl Harbor attack on the radio and newspaper. These reports helped to inspire Americans to volunteer for the war. Within days, recruiting stations were opened 24 hours a day to accommodate hundreds of thousands of men and women who wanted to enlist for the war. The Americans' entry into the war after Pearl Harbor as part of the Allied forces was deemed as a vital turning point in World War II. Many believe that the Americans were a huge factor in halting and eventually overcoming Nazi Germany's advance across all Europe. Psychologically, this also convinced Allied forces that if they could overcome Nazi Germany in Europe, they could overcome the Japanese in Asia as well. So this is the end of my video on Pearl Harbor. If you like my video, please give a thumbs up and make sure you subscribe to my channel. Also, please feel free to put your opinions in the comment section below on what other videos you would like to see in this channel. Thank you for watching and see you soon.